All right, this week we are wrapping up our series called Housewarming. We've been spending the last 3 weeks looking at how we can warm our houses, how we can strengthen our relationships, how the most intimate relationships that we have, the stronger they are. We actually believe that the stronger we have our relationships at home, it'll actually impact our new home that we're about to collectively move into in just a few months. Anyone excited? Right? So we believe if your marriages are stronger, if your parenting relationships are stronger, if your relationships with your neighbors are stronger, then we will be able to love people better, just that much better, every time they walk in the doors of our new home coming up. Now, in week 1, Jordan talked about loving our neighbors and just the standard and mandate for love. And then last week, Buck talked about what it looks like to warm our houses in terms of our dating and marriage relationships, that God actually provides them to us as a mirror, as a way that we can know ourselves. And this week, you've probably noticed that someone is up here with me. Now, if you've seen Klein before, if you've been at North Point for a while, you might be familiar with her. Klein is on staff here at North Point as our social media director, but she also volunteers as a host on Sunday mornings from time to time, and she is our Mosaic director. Mosaic is our global engagement ministry, so Klein manages our trips and our partnership with Fountain of Life Church in Juja, Kenya. And this morning, Klein is with me because I'm old. And I know some of you are like, oh, that's just not a nice thing to say about yourself. But I am, in fact, older than many of you in the room, and I'm also not as old as some of you in the room. But this morning we want to have a conversation around something we think the Bible talks a lot about, but it's just all too often a one-sided conversation.
Jen, you're not old. You're just seasoned.
I'm kidding. It's a great way to start, Klein.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Forgive me, please. Now, like Jen said, you maybe have seen me around North Point in some capacity, but never in this capacity on a Sunday morning teaching.
How do you feel?
My heart rate is like very, very high. I have an Oura ring, so it's probably going to report to me after and say like, take deep breaths.
Okay.
But I feel good. I'm excited to be here this morning and just wanted to introduce myself. But first, if you've been around North Point for a while, you're probably more familiar with some of our other faces of our teaching team. You're probably used to Buck, always up here sharing about his amazing wife, Jill, his 5 sons. Or you've seen Jordan talk about his wife, Emily, and their adorable 2-year-old son, Davis, who seriously is the cutest kid ever. Or you've seen Jen up here, always making fun of her husband, Sal, from stage. Shout out, Sal.
That's fair. That's fair.
But you haven't heard from me in this capacity on a Sunday morning, so I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Klein. I am 23 years old. I'm officially an adult. Woo! However, if you're my parents...
Half the room cheered, and the other half was like, no.
Well,
not at all.
My parents are part of the group that's probably laughing because my dad loves to remind me every single day that if I'm not doing my oil changes, hanging things on the wall, or filing my taxes without calling him like 5 to 7 times, that I'm not a real adult yet. So it's a work in progress, but we're getting there. I graduated from the University of Texas, hook 'em horns. You're probably like, how do they keep finding these people? I don't know. We're just around.
I'm sorry.
But I got my degree in marketing. I work in the world of e-commerce, but I also get to help with some really cool projects here at North Point as well. Here is a picture of my family. It is me, my parents, my brother Mason, his wife Caroline. Mason and Caroline are married, and they are actually expecting their first baby this summer, so I'm gonna be an aunt. I'm so excited, yes. But in classic younger sister energy, I just needed to emphasize the point that I am cooler than my brother. And when I explain his career, his job, you'll understand why I'm emphasizing that. I never made varsity in high school. It's something I love to remind people of. I just never made the cut. My brother, on the other hand, is a professional athlete. He's a professional baseball player, so pretty cool job. He actually recently signed a contract with the Texas Rangers. So if you love baseball, maybe you'll see him at the Express this season or in the big leagues. He's 6'6", redhead. You can't miss him. But I'm cooler than him, believe it or not. I just like to emphasize
that. We will let him know.
I know, he's probably watching online like, seriously? Like right now you had to say that? But it's just, younger sister, I have to keep it up. But I was actually first invited to North Point as an 8th grader. There's an old photo of me whenever I was invited in 8th grade. First to Camp 75. I'd never stepped foot in this building. I knew like 2 people's names. I was terrified. I wasn't really involved in church all the time. We didn't go every single Sunday or anything like that. So it was really new for me. It was outside of my comfort zone. But I actually came to faith here, and North Point has absolutely changed my life, changed my friendships, my family, my relationships, and I'm just so grateful for this place. So getting to be here and speak on a Sunday morning is like crazy full circle for me because I used to be a student like right at the front watching all these messages. So it's a little crazy to be here full circle this morning. And I feel like I'm up here as a result of so many people who have been for me here at North Point. If you've been around North Point for a while, maybe you've heard us say that we are for the next generation. That's not just a statement that was written by parents for their kids. It's really something that we mean here at North Point. Between generations, we really care about the one that is coming after us. We recognize that one day they are the leaders that are going to take over the church. We want to give them something significant to do. We want to mentor them. And I feel like so many people did that for me. And so that's why I get to be up here on a Sunday morning like this, to be a part of a conversation between generations and just get to talk about what that looks like. This isn't just a conversation for parents and their kids. This really is a conversation for every single one of us. Because every single day, all over the world, people miss each other because of these generational gaps.
I think part of our tension, actually, in a lot of parts of our lives is actually a generational issue. I mean, think about maybe tension you're experiencing at home, your family dynamic. Consider maybe childhood wound stuff, or you've dealt with tension at work, or even our communal or our political tension has a generational dynamic at play. And we just wanted to give voice to that this morning and see what God might do. And we thought it'd be best to do that across 2 generations. Now, I'm technically a Gen Xer. Actually, researchers say that I'm part of a micro-generation that sits in between Gen X and millennials, meaning I can kind of relate to both of them. I actually grew up pre-internet. There was a time that the internet wasn't around. I adapted early to technology, and here's what that means. That means my elementary school years were governed by Oregon Trail time. If you ever played Oregon Trail. Right? Then gaming systems emerged when I was in middle school. In high school, people started to get car phones, but they were actual phones that had to stay in the car and had a cord with them. And then in college, I got my first cell phone, and you had to pay by the minute, so when the first minute was free, that was a big deal. And then texting started to become a thing right about when I got my first MySpace account.
Jen, I didn't realize that you were on the Oregon Trail.
Not on it, but, I recovered really well from dysentery.
She was teaching me this morning about Oregon Trail because she showed me the picture. I've never seen that before.
Yeah, so. I had to explain. We had to Google dysentery. Yeah. Don't use an image search on that. Don't do it.
So I am a part of Gen Z, which is anyone between 1997 and 2012. So a lot of our students in the room, you are a part of Gen Z, or parents, you might even have a kid that is a part of Gen Z. And we are digital natives. We grew up online. We adapted to so many new forms of technology. In fact, I don't remember a time when there wasn't Wi-Fi. Okay. I know, crazy. Yeah, I don't remember a time paying for text messages that, I was a little young for that. I also, barely remember spending $1.29 to download something on iTunes. And then now it's just, woo, Spotify, Apple Music, everything's great. Social media was something that came up during my childhood, and it just never went away. The world has not been the same since Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and Snapchat and all of these things have kind of taken over our digital landscape. Whether you like it or not, it really has transformed the world that we live in today, and specifically my generation. Now, you might relate to my list, you might relate to Jen's list, you might relate to a list of your own, but what's true is that if you grew up in a different generation than someone else, you experience a very different world growing up. And that can lead to a gap between our generations.
The reason that we have a phrase called generation gap, started using it around the 50s or 60s, but it actually emerged during Carl Mannheim's research during the 1920s, when he wrote a paper called The Problem of Generations. And what he observed is that generations experiencing different things, cultural upheaval, unrest, economic shifts, wars, literally experience an entirely different world. Essentially, what he said is, we don't just disagree across generations. We're not even having the same conversation. We're not even starting from the same place. And so we wanted to look at that. This isn't a new thing. Generations gaps have been around since generations have existed. In fact, we read in the Old Testament, one of the first notes about a generation gap. It says this in the book of Judges. The author highlights, after that whole generation, the author's talking about the generation that had been with Moses, had fled Egypt, gone to the promised land, experienced so many different things. After that whole generation had passed and gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Now, to summarize a story that spans multiple chapters and several generations, here's how this goes. The first group had seen the Exodus, experienced going from Egypt to the promised land, experienced countless miracles, conquered land under Joshua, and personally witnessed God's power, his provision, and his faithfulness. And a couple generations later, that's just assumed. That's what's inherited. They grow up in the promised land. They have benefited from God's faithfulness. They've inherited the peace and the territory and the identity. Each generation experienced something radically different. Now, I'm sure that stories were told and memories were shared, but the reality is, even you, as you share about your experiences in your life, they can't experience it with you They can't experience it for you. And this is why we have a gap. And for ancient Israel and for us today, the gap is unavoidable. But I think the main issue that we learn is it's really more that it was unaddressed. And so we're wondering this morning what would happen if we actually address the generation gaps between us.
I believe faith is actually one of the biggest areas where our generations miss each other. I think about my parents' generation, the world that they grew up in, and the idea that faith was more on the forefront of culture. It was something that people talked about in neighborhoods and schools, and maybe what you believed was assumed, or even your church attendance was assumed. And even if that's not what you grew up in that atmosphere, that wasn't the experience that you have, you probably remember a world that was more shaped by faith. In 2026, the world that Gen Z is growing up in today couldn't be any more different. We're experiencing a culture where faith is rarely on the forefront of that. In fact, skepticism and question asking and kind of rejection towards the one-size-fits-all faith is really what we're experiencing as a generation. We've seen time and time again on television and newspapers and magazines the church fail publicly. And it has prompted our generation to ask more questions. Instead of just what am I supposed to believe, we started asking questions like, is this safe? Is this real? Does this hold up in real life? Now, these aren't questions that no generation before us has asked, but I really do believe as a generation, we have started to approach faith a little bit differently. For us as a generation, sometimes faith has felt like answers with no room for questions, or certainty without space for wrestling, or even obedience without explanation. Now, I can only imagine on the other side of us as our parents how that might feel to you. I think our skepticism and question asking sometimes feels like questions that are rejection, or independence that feels like disconnection, or even skepticism that feels like mistrust. Now, if you're in the room or watching online this morning and you do not believe what we believe, or you're not a parent, you might be sitting there and wondering, is this even relevant to me? But I would argue that I think this is relevant to every single one of us, because it goes way beyond faith. It goes way beyond parents and their children. This, again, is something all over the world every single day that people experience. They miss each other. One example I was thinking of this week is just mental health. I think, again, to the world that my parents grew up in and what mental health looked like back then. It was something that maybe was considered a weakness, or you were supposed to work through in private. In 2026, mental health is something that people talk about all the time. We share about it, we label it, we name it. Now, you can go too far in either one of those directions, but don't you see how that can create a gap between our generations? Or I think about the job market, and the job market that my parents 10, 20, 30 years ago were looking for jobs in, compared to the job market that we experience today. I mean, there's more hybrid and remote work than ever before. You can make money from your cell phone on social media. That didn't exist 10, 20 years ago in the same way that it does today. Our generations are experiencing different worlds. Sometimes that causes a gap between us.
And can you see how if your narrative is the only narrative that you have, the way that you experience the world is the only one that you're expecting your kids to understand, or the way that you think the world should have been is the only map you're trying to overlay on your kids, it can create some tension. The Old Testament's not the only place we see the conversation around generations addressed. Paul, a leader in the early church, looks at a younger leader named Titus and says, hey, as you're leading this growing group of Christians, you're going to have a lot of diversity in it, and I want to share with you some suggestions on how to lead them and guide them. He says this. He says, teach the older men, and you can decide, by the way, I'm not going to tell you which one older men are, you can decide where you see yourself in this. Teach the older men to be temperate, worthy of respect, self-controlled and sound in faith, and in love and endurance. And then he keeps thinking of this wide audience, and he says, likewise, teach the older women, see if this resonates with anybody, to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to too much wine, but to teach what... That was when I'm an older woman. That is fair. But to teach what is good. And then they can urge younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind. By the way, men, don't use the busy at home thing as instructions. You're not Paul. But anyway, to be kind and to be subject to their husbands so that no one will malign the word of God. Now, that whole be subject to their husbands is actually a conversation we've had several times here at North Point. Buck even alluded to its actual intent and purpose last week in his message, but just kind of stay focused with me on just the generational conversation this morning, because he continues. Similarly, encourage the young men to be self-controlled in everything. Set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, whoever is teaching, show integrity, seriousness and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about us. The point is, Paul is giving Titus instructions to instruct both generations, all generations. He's like, hey, older men, be temperate, respectful, controlled, sound in faith. Older women, be reverent, don't gossip, watch the wine, teach good things. Younger women, love your husbands and children well, have self-control, be kind. Younger men, be controlled, set an example, do good. Everyone, use integrity, have integrity, and use words wisely. That is not to say that we wouldn't all benefit from everything on Paul's list. More the point is that Paul is saying, hey, we've all got to check ourselves. We've all got to pay attention to our posture and how we're showing up and behaving in the world, because it matters across generations, just because your behavior matters.
So what does the Bible actually say about this? I want to take a look at a verse that's pretty famous. If you've been in church for a while, maybe you've heard part of this verse or the entire verse. It's a verse in the book of Ephesians. It's written by Paul. And Paul starts off by addressing the first generation. He starts off with children. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. Parents are probably like, that sounds great. Let's go home.
Amen.
But there's another part of the verse, and I want to read that one as well. He continues. He addresses the next generation. He says, fathers, parents, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. I think some of us, maybe you've heard this verse before, and we often pay attention to what it says about someone else instead of what it says about us. What I think is so important in this verse is that Paul addresses both generations. Paul says that we each have a role to play when it comes to better relationships with one another, bridging the gap between generations. There's a role for each of us to play. I want you to pause and just consider this verse for yourself. Where is the part that you feel like you have tension with? What is the part that you want to focus more in on? And if I'm being honest, a lot of times I found myself reading the Bible about what does it say about other people? What does God call other people to? But there's a lot of things that we miss in the Bible when we're not willing to open up our heart to what it has to say about ourselves. So I don't want you to miss this morning that verse, it's so important to not miss that we each have a role to play. But I would say that knowing our role isn't enough if our posture towards one another is wrong. So what does the Bible actually say about our posture towards one another? I was asking myself this past few weeks as I was preparing for this message, and I feel like if you've ever read scripture or if you've looked at the life of Jesus, it's overwhelmingly clear again and again that Jesus has a posture of love. I could share a million parables or stories or examples of that in the Bible. I think you should read some of it. It is so clear again and again that he says we should have a posture of love. But again, one of the most famous verses in the Bible that's often shared at weddings when it talks about love is in 1 Corinthians. Maybe you've heard it before. Chapter 13, verse 5, it talks about love. What is love? Love, it does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. And it keeps no record of wrongs. God calls us to a really high standard when he discusses our posture towards one another. I was reading this like, oh, I definitely don't do that sometimes with my parents, with my siblings. I think back to high school, I probably had a running list somewhere in like a notepad of all the things my brother or my parents did to frustrate me. It's so easy to get this wrong. Most of us do, and I know personally I do a lot. But God is so clear that we each have a role to play in bridging the gap between generations, but he's also so clear that we should have a posture of love towards one another.
So when you think about your posture, think about how you show up with your kids. Think about how you show up at work if you work with younger people. What stance do you actually take? How do you approach them? I think there's a lot we can learn. There's this one moment, though, that I recently heard an expert in childhood development. Dr. Russell Barkley is a clinical psychologist. He's a researcher. He's an expert, actually, in attention deficit disorder, or ADHD, as well. He travels the world talking about what psychology and neuroscience has taught us over the last 20 years about our kids. And he was recorded at a conference, and his message so profoundly impacted my posture, my stance, my approach in parenting. I wanted to share the whole thing with you, but then you wouldn't have heard from anything of us. So I wrote down the most powerful parts, I thought, because I wanted to share it with you. Because see, I am somewhat of a picky parent. My kids are in their 20s, both of my sons, and I really don't care. I still tell them exactly how they should live, and I have this idea of exactly how I want them to still turn out. But Dr. Barkley's words kind of challenged me. He says this: you do not get to design your children. Nature would never let you have that degree of power. Your child is born with more than 400 psychological traits, genetically influenced brain functions that will emerge as they mature and have nothing to do with you. That was the hardest part for me to hear, if you can't tell. So the idea that you will engineer personality, IQ, academic achievement, or certain skill sets is simply not true. Your child is not a blank slate on which you get to write. Let that sink in for myself again. Your child is a unique combination of your genetic line. You are not an engineer. You are, however, a shepherd. A shepherd doesn't design the sheep. Shepherds are powerful people. They pick the pastures in which the sheep graze. They determine if they are properly nourished. They protect them from harm. The environment is important, but it doesn't design the sheep. No shepherd turns a sheep into a dog. You have influence as a shepherd, but you have to stop parenting like an engineer. I wanted to set up my kids for every opportunity. So I'm pretty sure that as soon as they came out of the womb, I started playing those baby Einstein videos. If you remember those, I was like, they're going to be geniuses. This is what's going to do it. And then when they were toddlers, I set up learning centers in nearly every room in our home. I read every parenting book I could get my hands on, and I don't think that was negative or wrong, but I'll be honest. Even after all that effort and energy, there have been many moments as a parent I feel like I have failed. See, we feel like a failure when our creation doesn't turn out like we want, doesn't behave like we want, or like we imagined. Or, on the other side, we become prideful, and we think that the reason that they are so fill in the blank is because of something we've done. Over 23 years in ministry, I have yet to see a perfectly behaved child. I think I have seen every parenting style imaginable. And I think maybe part of the reason I haven't seen perfect kids yet is because I haven't met perfect parents. But actually, I think even more than that is because our kids are their own person. Our children are their own unique individual. And yes, we have influence and we have power and we are meant to shepherd them, but we aren't building them. We aren't creating them. So when we get frustrated with ourselves, or we think the time that we lost our temper is the reason that they're now doing X, Y, Z, or that time we were so exhausted we just couldn't follow through with that discipline, that's why they ended up like this, please stop. You have influence, but they are their own individual already. Jesus, or God, is referenced as a shepherd over 100 times across the Bible. What if that's part of the point? What if the God that created the universe designed us to be in relationship with him? So wiring in us free will and choice, that we get the choice to obey or not, to listen or not, to mature or not. And sometimes sheep aren't always the easiest to care for. I for sure was not when I was younger. In fact, just the other day when they were home for Christmas break, my 21-year-old son and I were talking, and I was just explaining to him how wrong his life choices were. And he was actually respectfully listening, and so I just continued on a litany of, I think, perfect instructions, that if he would just do things this way as I was laying them out. And when I got done, he just respectfully said, he said, "Mom, I hear you, and I'm actually working on it, but it's not in your way, and it's not at your pace." That was, okay. He's not wrong. God has an intent for your kids that actually is outside of us. They are their own unique individuals, and we don't have children so they become carbon copies of us or become the copies of the things that we wish we could have done. It's so that they can grow up and fully experience what God has planned for them that is actually, and this is hard, totally outside us. And this doesn't just apply to parenting, this also applies to the younger people that we work with. They are individuals too. Your job is not to sit there and critique them and judge them. Your job is to shepherd them, encourage them, and protect them.
So Gen Z, young adults, my generation, to wrap, I'm going to speak to just a few pieces of advice that I have been working through in my own life that I think have helped me, that I'm not great at, but I'm learning. But first, I think that we live in a culture today that is suffering from this idea of self-serving bias. It's something that I've seen growing up in my own life, but also people around me. It's a cognitive tendency to attribute positive events to internal factors, skill and effort, but attribute negative results or events to external factors, other people or bad luck. This is the voice in your head, maybe right now or parts of this message, that have been thinking about someone else, maybe instead of yourself. Students, this is the voice in our head that whenever I was in high school, if we won a game, I would attribute it to my athletic ability. And if we lost a game, I would attribute it to, a coach's decision or a ref call. I didn't make varsity, so that was only like 2 years of high school, but just play with me. So But adults, again, in my adult life, I've learned this at work as well, that if something goes right or goes well, sometimes I attribute that to my skill or my hard work, but if something goes wrong, it's really easy to look at a boss or a coworker and think about what did they do in this situation. It's the voice in our head that neglects to own our part. And so my goal with wrapping this message is just to talk about what are some things that us as a generation, Gen Z, young adults, how can we own our part? The first example, again, way easier said than done, is that listening is not a weakness. I think you can be upset, angry, frustrated with your parents, and still choose to listen. And again, I'm so bad at this sometimes. It is way easier said than done. I've had a million moments or milestones or times where I've chosen not to listen, and I feel like at the end of it, it hurts relationship, it breaks trust. It's not just something I've learned, this is something that is spoken about in the Bible. James chapter 1, verse 19 says, "Understand this, my dear brothers and sisters, you must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry." Again, I think our world wants us to think that choosing to listen is a weakness, that we're gonna lose. But that brings me to my second point. I think when it comes to relationship with each other and with our parents, there is no single winner or loser. When we choose to disobey, when we choose to dishonor, when we choose to disengage, again, I'm so bad at this and need to hear this a million times to really learn. But I think that we sometimes believe that if we choose to fight back and argue, we're gonna win. But what do we actually win in those moments? I've had arguments or moments where I've walked away, I'm like, yeah, I won that argument, especially with my older brother. But then, an hour later, I'm like, oh, this is gonna be really awkward, A, when we see each other the next time, or B, when I have to apologize later, because what did I actually win in that moment? I think when we disobey, dishonor, disengage, that we both lose, because it's broken trust and it's broken relationships with the people around us. The last one I wanna share is more of like an analogy, so hang with me for just a second. It's this idea when it comes to our relationships that we really have to keep checking the mail. This is something that was shared with me from a small group leader here at North Point in our young adults group, and they were emphasizing this idea when it comes to our relationship with Christ, but I think it's just as important when it comes to our relationships with each other and with our relationships with our parents. So imagine just for a second, think about your neighborhood mailbox, the one that's maybe down the street or outside your house. You go every week, sometimes every day, to see if there's mail. There's only one way to find out if there's mail, and it's actually to check the mailbox. Some days you will check the mailbox, there will be something inside. Other days you will check, there will be nothing. Some days there's good news, there's something you've been waiting for, maybe you've had tracking information, you're waiting on that package, but the only way to actually know if it's arrived is to check the mailbox. And it would be amazing if it could just show up on our kitchen dining room table and just be there for us. But to know if you have mail, you have to go check the mailbox. I think the same is true with our relationships with one another. To see if there is restored trust or restored relationship or restoring the gap between one another, we have to do our part. In this analogy, it's checking the mail. It's leaning in, it's engaging. Students, young adults, it's sometimes putting our phone away when we don't want to. Again, so much easier said than done. But we have to own our part in checking the mail to restore relationship with one another. To wrap, I want to end with just one little story, and I hope that this is in some way encouraging to the parents in the room. I am not a parent, but I am a small group leader here at Inside Out. I lead an incredible group of sophomore girls, and they're amazing, but I empathize with you parents because I've had moments where I'm like, wow, I can't imagine how hard parenting is. I had to explain to my girls a few weeks ago why they couldn't pierce each other's ears after small group. And like, you would have thought I was telling them like 2 plus 2 does not equal 4 anymore. Like they were just not getting it. So I empathize with you. Parenting, I can imagine it's hard, I don't know, but being on the other side of them, I've experienced a few moments that have made me empathize with you. However, I have experienced so many great conversations and moments in small groups. I get to be face-to-face behind the scenes with some of your kids. And I have been encouraged time and time again by the way that they speak about their parents and by the way that, or about the way that they speak towards relationships with their parents and how they desire relationships with their parents. I've had girls raise their hand in small group and share about when they got in the car after school. They were exhausted, they had a really hard day. Their mom or dad asked them how their day was, and they just didn't have the energy to give to that relationship in that moment. They got on their phone, they disengaged, and they felt really bad about it. They're sharing in small group, I know my parents love me. I wish in that moment I wouldn't have behaved that way. And on the other side of them, parents, I can only imagine that that feels sometimes like rejection, hurt feelings. But I've been so encouraged time and time again by the way that they speak about their parents. I've reminded them time and time again, we have to own our part. We have to check the mail. We have to put our phones away. We have to engage in the relationship as well. But I think the enemy would want you parents to leave the room this morning and feel like you failed, feel like your kids don't like you, feel like when they're disengaging, it's something that you've done wrong. But they also have to own their part. And so I hope that that provides even an ounce of hope or encouragement for you this morning, that I've heard some of your kids talk about relationship with you and how much they desire that. We were designed for relationship. I think that there is hope across generations, but each of us have to own our part and our posture towards one another.
So generation gaps aren't new. The Old Testament mentions them. Paul instructs us to work within them. And so I want to actually use Klein's list, just a little tilted more toward us, maybe slightly older people, the same things, but asking us what we can practically do. I think sometimes as parents, we can forget that listening is not a weakness. We can be so caught up in giving lectures, so caught up in giving instructions that we have forgotten to listen. We don't approach them curious. We might ask a pat, how is your day question, and then we shut down when they shut down and we get responsive with that. And so I just want to encourage us, listening is not a weakness. I know as a parent, we often have the upper hands and we get to do most of the talking, but sometimes that's actually not the point. That you can just look for opportunities to connect with your kids in everyday ordinary moments just through listening. Also, just to Klein's point, there is no single winner or loser. When I think about the leverage we have as older people, especially as parents in a particular relationship dynamic, we can pick who the winner or the loser is. But you know what? You can absolutely win that battle with your kid. You can absolutely assert control and still lose their heart and still miss them entirely. And then to Klein's point, we have to keep checking the mail too. There have been so many moments and seasons in parenting that I have wanted to just shut down. And I've been so exhausted. But I have to keep showing up. Stay the adult in the room. Same thing even in a work dynamic. I can be so frustrated that they don't understand, or I feel like this generation gap is just too wide. And I can easily just move on instead of being curious about what they're struggling with and what they're thinking of. I think when it comes to checking the mail, all too often as parents, we only check the mail when it's time for a lecture, when something has happened, they've gotten in trouble, and it's now a crisis. But what if we looked for ordinary moments, just easy ways while we're taking a ride in the car or taking a walk, just to be curious? I love, Shane Norcross, our connections director, has a phrase that he uses that I love. It says, get shoulder to shoulder with boys and face to face with girls. That when trying to connect with a younger man, like do an activity, actually work on a car, do something with them, be busy with them. But when it comes to connecting with a young woman, just to sit and ask and listen with your full self. And then I just want to wrap up with the same thing Klein did. For those of you that are younger that are dealing with parents like me, just praying for you, and those of you that have parents at all, don't give up on us either. We are trying and we are learning. And for those of us with adult parents, we don't get to give up on them either. You know that whole honor your father and mother thing? It doesn't have an age limit. It's not given parameters. My parents are still learning and growing, and God is doing things in their lives, and I am still learning and growing, and God is doing things in my life, and my kids are still learning and growing. God's plan all along was multi-generational. We were supposed to be doing this together, but we forget. We're not supposed to be doing it as judges and critics and lecturers, but as encouragers, protectors, and shepherds. I'm going to ask Klein to close us in prayer.
Dear God, thank you so much for this morning. Thank you for the opportunity that we get to come together, be together. God, we are just so grateful for the way that you have orchestrated the relationships in our lives with one another, cross-generationally, also with our parents. God, would you help remind us this morning that we are each called, each generation, each role is called to something. God, would you remind us that we should approach relationships in our life with postures of love? God, would you help us remember and look back to the life of Jesus and how Jesus lived this out every single day? God, would you help us be quick to listen, slow to speak, to keep checking the mail, to keep engaging and doing our part? God, I pray that you will remind us as we leave this morning to listen to what is true, what you have to say about us and our relationships with one another. Thank you for this morning, God. Thank you for this time together. We pray this all in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. See you guys next week.